have a caveman brain. What? So I always talk about this, and I always need to remind myself that actually when people listen to me or when they come into my world, they're not familiar with the language that I use. So I use terms like primitive brain and caveman brain, and I think it can easily maybe get somebody's back up. They think that I'm insulting them by telling them they're a caveman. But obviously that's not the case. So this episode is to explain some of the terminology that I use all the time to explain what is going on, like what type of brain do we have, and the key things about the brain that make us live and get stuck in the ways that we do. And so the first thing to know is that your brain hasn't evolved since the caveman days. Um, and that's not great, because when you think of technology, we always need to do updates, software updates, and make sure that we're running the most efficient program that's ready for new challenges. But we're still walking around with a brain that's designed for caveman days, so caveman threats, for example. And so it feels right that when we look at our brain and how it works through the lens of what life was like as a caveman, it makes sense. Everything that our brain does makes sense in that context. But life is very different now, much safer, um, with so many different variables and just a completely different scenario. And so what goes wrong is that we have this survival mode that's there to keep us safe and to protect us, that we end up stuck in so easily. And the problem is that most people don't know how the brain works, and therefore you can get stuck in survival mode and not even realize it, because you're always living with your brain and your experience of life. You never know what it's like to be somebody else. And so you've only ever got this one perspective, this one experience. So you can literally go 20 years living in survival mode. I see this, by the way. I see people in my personal life and people that I come across. And obviously, as a therapist, I'm not going to say, hey, you're in survival mode. There's a time and a place for these things. And people need to be ready for change. And people need to work at their own pace and come to their own understandings. But I see it. And the problem is they don't know. And so this has brought me to this realization that I need to share my knowledge with the world much more further than just on my Instagram page or in my Facebook group. Hence the reason for this podcast. But I digress. So back to the caveman brain. Its only purpose, your brain's only priority is to keep you alive, okay, to survive. And so it doesn't care whether you're happy or not. It doesn't care whether you're confident. It doesn't care whether you're successful. And some of the things that our brain does to keep you alive are things that make you very unhappy. And it doesn't care. It really doesn't care. It will do what it needs to do to keep you safe. And that, for example, if that is inducing a panic attack or giving you a migraine as a warning sign that you need to slow down and rest or whatever, it's going to do what it needs to do to get the message across to you. And so this is why we can have so many signs, physical signs that happen with our health that are actually related to our stress and what's going on. Because when we get stuck in survival mode, there's too much adrenaline being released and too much stress in your body. And the word disease, when you actually break it down, is just dis-ease. All right. We are not designed to live our lives day in, day out in survival mode. It's a stressful place to be for your mind and your body, because it's literally functioning on all cylinders to try and keep you alive. That's not appropriate. You only need that fight or flight mode, which is survival mode, by the way. You only need that to step in when you really need it. And there's so many things to unpick here. But basically, your brain can't tell the difference between real and imagination. And so if you are the kind of person who overthinks and who runs worst case scenarios and who runs ideas of what possibly could go wrong, which is your brain just trying to keep you safe, if you're doing that, you're putting your brain through absolute hell because it can't tell the difference between real and imagination. So every time you're worrying and picturing worst case scenario, at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to sleep, your brain is firing off the stress hormone that it needs to, as if that is actually happening. And you'll know this. Let me give you a positive example of this, of how all of our thoughts are related, are completely linked to chemical reactions. When we think something, it releases a chemical reaction. So on the negative side, when we start getting stressed about something, worrying about something going wrong, we start releasing stress hormones because we don't know whether it's actually happening now or not. We can't tell the difference between real and imagination. So we release all of these stress hormones, and then we get worked up and panicky and on edge, and these feelings. But on the positive side, a positive example of that is if you start picturing a really funny scene in a movie, or a really funny joke that you heard recently, or something absolutely hilarious. If you're just walking along the street and you think that, you could easily find yourself smiling. Okay, it just makes you feel good. And so when you feel good, you smile. And or I get this all the time when I'm working with clients and we're picturing what they can see themselves doing the next day because they're feeling more confident, or more positive, or more energetic, whatever. I get excited for them. I get this every single time I work with a client. I feel so excited for their future. And on discovery calls as well, I can see the future version of them when they're telling me what they want to get from our work together. I get excited. And that is purely because my brain can't tell the difference between real and imagination. And so when we're talking about positive things, it makes us feel good. And by the way, that's why I am a solution focused therapist. It's so fulfilling to work in a solution focused way because it feels good. More importantly, it feels good for the clients, but it feels good for me too. So yeah, back to the brain then. It can't tell the difference between real and imagination. So every time that you're worrying about what could go wrong, your poor brain is going through that that worst case scenario. And by definition, worst case scenario is always going to be the worst. This is your brain trying to keep you safe, by the way, to cover all can't remember what the phrase is, to cover all potential scenarios. It has to think that. And so, yeah, you end up doing all of these things which are really not good for your body or your mind, or your physical health, and you get stuck. You don't know how your brain works. So you get stuck in this survival mode. And the more you worry, and the more you imagine things going wrong, or the more you overthink, you're creating anxiety in your body, and it goes into what I call the stress bucket. All right. Everybody has a stress bucket in there, not a literal one, but like a metaphorical stress bucket. And the more full that stress bucket is, the harder it is to cope with the ups and downs of life. So this is, that saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. If you're feeling really overwhelmed, something tiny could be what pushes you over the edge, so that you feel like you just cannot cope anymore. But then if you picture a time in your life when you're much less stressed and things are all great and you're feeling really, really good, then you can cope with a lot more. And yeah, just stuff doesn't bother you as much when your stress bucket levels are low. And this is, when clients come to work with me, their stress bucket levels are high. And a sign of that is often poor sleep. If you're waking up in the night, or you're just finding that you're not coping very well. You're either getting upset, or you're getting frustrated or irritated far too easily. It's a sign that your stress bucket levels are too high. And when your stress bucket levels are high, you can't function as easily. You're much more likely to dip into your primitive brain and go into survival mode. So your primitive brain, I'm sure you've gathered by now, but your primitive brain is very negative. It has to be, to make sure that you stay alive. Now, we don't want to be living in our primitive brain. It's too negative. It releases far too many stress hormones and adrenaline, and basically makes us feel exhausted, because when we have a rush of adrenaline, we end up feeling exhausted afterwards. We don't want that roller coaster of emotions going on in our body. Where we want to be, and where we want to be living our life, is from the intellectual mind. Because when you are in your intellectual mind, you can access like the best ideas, the best solutions. You can have perspective and you can think clearly and you can have fun and be yourself and feel joy in the present moment. And really importantly, you can actually be present. If you're in your primitive brain and survival mode and you're stuck overthinking all the time, you can't fully enjoy life now in the present moment because you're too busy worrying about something that you said or didn't say, or something that might or might not happen. You can't really fully enjoy the present moment. And the only moment we have is now. And so you need to be getting the best out of yourself and the best out of your life and the best out of your relationships is to be living in your intellectual mind so that your stress bucket levels are low, you find enjoyment, and you just are able to feel confident and free and like you are in control rather than your emotions controlling you. And so, yeah, I am so privileged in the work that I do because in my Change Your Life program, whenever clients come to me, whenever somebody talks to me on a discovery call, they're in that place where they're in survival mode and they're not enjoying life. They're unhappy or stressed or whatever the symptoms are. Essentially, they're living from their primitive brain, stuck in survival mode. And like I said earlier, I can see the future version of them because they've told me what they want to change, and I can see that. I see that potential. I see what it's going to be like come 12 weeks down the line. My program's 12 weeks, by the way. I can see what it's going to be like at the end, and it's so exciting. And you can literally see their face sort of light up at the prospect of what could be different if we could get rid of all of these issues, or basically teach them how the brain works so that they live differently. And obviously have the hypnosis to change and let go of all of the unhelpful patterns and programs that are stuck underneath, in the background, in the subconscious mind, because by definition, the subconscious mind is stuff that you're unaware of. And there can be so much happening in the background that is causing you to feel the way that you're feeling when you come to me on a discovery call. And we can change that powerfully with hypnosis very, very quickly. And so, yeah, that's essentially why I love what I do and why I want to share these gifts with you guys, because when you know how your brain works, it's so different. So just in this episode, just learning the fact that you have a primitive brain that is very negative, that when you're in survival mode will not let you think clearly, will get you to do coping mechanisms because it doesn't care about your happiness. It cares about you getting through the here and now. And if that is eating a whole tub of Ben and Jerry's ice cream, or staying up till 3 a.m, binge watching Netflix, or drinking too much, or whatever your go-to coping mechanism is, that's happening because your primitive brain is in control. And when you're stuck with a bad habit that you don't want to have, you're going to need to get into your intellectual mind so that you've got control of your feelings. For example, let's just take eating healthily. It's so much harder to eat healthily when you're in your primitive brain, because your primitive brain just wants you to rely on coping mechanisms to get through the next minute, the next hour, the next day. It doesn't care about the long-term happiness. When you're in your intellectual mind, that's where you've got the perspective to see what's good for you and your long-term goals, and have that motivation and that willpower to do something different rather than resorting to the coping mechanisms. Anyway, there is so much to unpack here that I have unpacked, but yeah, you feel free to listen to this again if you need to, because I've kind of packed a lot in the space of like 15 minutes. But I hope that this has helped you. If this is kind of the first time you've come across the things that I'm saying, I hope it's really helped you understand what's going on in your brain and how our brains function. Because yeah, unfortunately, we are walking around with a caveman brain, and we want to be able to get the best from it and really live the best versions of ourselves. And we can only do that from our intellectual mind. So if you have liked what you've heard and some stuff has really resonated with you, and you would like to find out more about my Change Your Life program, there is a link in the show notes to apply for a discovery call with me. Discovery calls are free. And yeah, if that feels a pull for you, then go ahead and click the link in the show notes. My links to Instagram and free sleep hypnosis audio are in there too. But yeah, if you are on Instagram or on Facebook and you want to send me a message, then please do. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you all soon. Bye.